Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? To Brother Ugawa, Sister Robin, Facebook user Stephen McKenzie, LaShonda Henderson. Welcome. How y'all doing? You okay? You cool? This is going to be part 2 of a discussion that we had last week to Ufedo, Ojo, and Gula. Good morning to you. Lisa Grayson from Atlanta. Good morning to you as well. So this will be part 2 on Dr. John Henry Clarke. What I want to do is really express my appreciation for the interest that you've been showing for the show, and especially for last week, the spirited comments and questions. It lasted for over an hour. That's really what I enjoy most about this show, is being able to get comments and questions. And every now and then I'll see something when the show's over that I missed, and when I do, I'll try and make comments on it. But they were very perceptive comments and questions. And of course, given how our minds work, sometimes the best question might not even have something to do with the topic directly, but it has something to do with it. Like, what got us here? I know this is off the subject, that's black folks for you. Good question. So I really enjoy the interest and the consciousness that you all bring. And I really appreciate it. And appreciate the fact that there's a growing interest as well. It's reflected in the growing numbers. I also want to pay a special thanks to people who donated last week without ignoring the people who have been donating all along. Sister Robin for one, Queen Mosley for another. There are a number of others who have, and it's really appreciated. And the donations that were made last week, all of which will be going to promote the show. So we can put more money into recruiting subscribers since we found out how to do that and we found a way to do it. So I wanted to thank Maurice Nelson, Wilford Dockett, Lucio Bitoy, Sister LaShonda Henderson, who has donated before and has made a commitment to doing a monthly contribution, which is really appreciated because that will really help us. So, I want to thank all of you for your donations. And then a number of people purchased books, and those will be going out next week. So that's all appreciated. I've been financing this thing mainly out of love, and getting a little help helps. It helps. We're also going to continue with what Brother Ogawa's done in terms of getting on other shows of like mine to draw viewers to this show. And that was Brother Ogawa's work with Hoppy, and that's been very good. And there's a nice alignment there in terms of consciousness, and the consciousness of that show is really appreciated. I've watched it before, and Brother James Smalls has also been helpful in getting me on other shows. And then he had to take a hit on Hoppy for not recommending me to Hoppy, but he's recommended me to so many others that I know that there was nothing in there, but he's just all over the place, So that's also what we'll be doing to grow the show and other things, You have been deluged by a lot of propaganda on Queen of England's death and all the great mourning that's going on behind it. And I'm not going to spend much time on it, except that in some ways the death is significant in that it is symbolic of the death of not only the British Empire, but of Western power in the world, both the decline and fall, brought about in part by two bloody world wars, where they nearly genocided themselves completely. One more world war between them, and they will cease to exist as a people. So this queen that they're shedding crocodile tears over, she presided over the decline and fall of the British Empire. I mean, that's basically what she's presided over, and heavy attempts on their part to hold on to power, like their suppression of the Mau Maus in Kenya. Brother on my Facebook page sent some details of some massacres done against the Mau Maus, which is a term the British created to define the freedom fighters who were fighting for their freedom, who did not call themselves Mau Maus. That was a term, a propaganda term used to discredit them. So the British, the French, the Americans, the Germans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, they have all played out their bloody role in bringing oppression and misery to the world. And the Queen has got to live in luxury over that, so you're not going to see any crocodile tears here from that. And the fact that the American corporate control media is going along with the moaning is an indication of how the rulers in this country identify with globalized imperialism, oppression, and the symbols of it. There's no other way they can describe or offer an excuse for this kind of stuff. So much for that. This show has been on my part a labor of love And it's been my effort to do my very best on every show to cover different areas, including African and African American history, um, African and African American culture, spirituality, creativity, our struggles for liberation, our quest for freeing our minds through relevant education, exploring just family systems, just society systems, and much more. So I took a different route than most shows take, which is the easy route of you just bring people on and they talk. And we do some of that. We bring on people who really have something to say special. We've had Baba Zak Kondo on, who is a very special scholar on Malcolm X and his assassination. My book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, was inspired his book, The Assassination of Malcolm X. And this is my first book. I don't know how many years it took me to write. Malcolm was my second master. So we've had him on, and he did a great job of covering the assassination. He is the best scholar on Malcolm's assassination. So those of you who are new to the show, you should go and look at Baba Zak Kondo's show on the assassination of Malcolm X. It's generated some of the highest views, a huge number of comments, and not one negative one. And that's interesting because it nailed down who killed Malcolm, and it's not a popular nail down. But this wasn't a hit show. This was a scholarly analysis of the background, the historical data on Malcolm's assassination. And among other things, Baba Zak Kondo went to the FBI files and went through them. And so all scholars who consider themselves experts on the assassination all say Baba Zak Kondo's work is the best. So when we bring someone on, they are the best of the best. The same thing with Dr. Professor Theophil Obenga. We had a conversation, and it's an in-depth conversation on African history. And check it out, and we'll have him on the end of this year. I talked to him about a month ago. He had been on vacation in France, and he's now busy with the new university that he laid out, that we featured in the interview with him. And then we've had Brother James Smalls on, and we dealt with the choice between two cultures, one of my contributions in terms of innovation in describing what's gone wrong, what's the cause of what's going on wrong in Black communities, and how to correct it. And we've had others on who have really brought insight. But my main purpose for this is to do a intergenerational sharing and to pass on wisdom, especially to the younger generation, and to share with my own and those in between. And so it was a pleasure when Brother Ugawa, I think at 38, started emailing me and saying that I'm watching all your shows. That's a sign of something, because I got quite a few. And they were 3-hour shows. And he was not watching them once, twice, 3 times. You know what I mean? And he was 38 then. And my aim is to reach a younger audience and then others as well, but especially a younger audience. I'm not into, as I pointed out to people who hear the show regularly, preaching to the choir alone. I mainly want to reach those that will be carrying this torch forward, So this is the real purpose of this show. So this has been a harder road because I featured a lot of different topics that have come from my own innovative thoughts and offered perspectives that you can use now. My overall approach in this show, if we're dealing with the past, is to make it serve the present. That's the purpose. By extracting from it those principles that we can use now. So I noted when I did the Hoppy show, one of the brothers from South Africa that watches the show said that he appreciates the pragmatism of it, meaning it's practical. But I know I'm going up against a hard wall because a lot of us think that our past is in the past. It's not useful now. And this is one of the things I shared with Professor John Henry Clarke in agreement. I didn't get this from him. He definitely didn't get it from me. We both agreed that the main purpose of studying your history, your culture, your past is to empower you so you can change your present and your future. That's the main reason. But we run up against the brainwashing that many of us, including African-centered people, have internalized, which is the notion that that's the dead past. And a lot of us think so because we were defeated. And therefore, if we are defeated, whatever we had before needs to be thrown out, the baby with the bathwater. You know, every people faced defeat in history, just like every people, as John Henry Clarke noted, faced enslavement. And the Europeans went through longer periods of enslavement and built their whole societies on it, with just an exception of people who were free. That was the Greeks, that was the Romans, that's the Americans, that's the Western system. Yet we can take these oppressive systems and live under them, moan and groan. But then when it comes to looking at our past, come up with things like communalism won't work today. It worked for nearly 200,000 years and produced societies where there was no poverty, no homelessness, no crime. And as John Henry Clarke would often say, no word for jails, let alone jails. Huh? And while we couldn't practice communalism in the Americas because we were treated as property and everything else was treated as property, we had the communal ethos of caring and sharing. And that's what enabled us to survive. And so something that worked, that produced justice for almost all of human history, we're going to throw it out for something that only works for a handful of people, that makes them rich and everybody else poor and miserable, you know? So I know that your past is the key to serving your present. That is extracting from it what you can use. And so that is a major purpose of this show, and therefore a heavy focus on just models, not just any models, JUST, models that are just. Knowing that under the circumstances that we're living today, whatever we extract from ancient African societies and traditional African societies, and ancient go back as far as 200,000 years, we're going to have to reapply them to new circumstances. And of course, there's always coming up with new stuff. And that's also a part of what your past encourages you to do. But we stand on solid historical ground. And John Henry Clarke, which I'm covering in these two series, is a living example of that, you know? But if you've been jaded into believing that your past ain't useful, that's a majority of people who think that. But Afrocentric people, some think, well, yeah, it's okay for yesterday, but we got to modernize. And there's no issue about modernizing, as long as that doesn't include killing the environment, fossil fuels, global warming, and all the things that are happening now. If you call that modernization, and by the way, it was called that because it was based on the Industrial Revolution. There was basically a system of oppression in Europe of workers based on the enslavement of Africans, the genocide of Native Americans, the theft of half of Mexico, northern Mexico, and genocide all over the world. That's what capitalism is based on. So when you understand the value of your past, you understand how well it worked for you when you were in charge, then what you do when you begin to reclaim your history is make the past serve the present. Draw from it those strengths that you can use, rearrange it, modify it, but draw on it. Africa's in trouble now because the leaders of Africa have taken the models of Europe and run with it. The nation state model, one of the things John Henry Clarke and I agreed on was that the Western nation state model is no good for Africa. John's reasoning was because the nation state model was a model with tight borders. And the model that Africa had didn't have tight borders. And it allowed in and out people from different ethnic groups. In fact, nations were usually multi-ethnic, though African, of different ethnicities, speaking a variety of languages and so forth. So that was the main point he made. And while I agree with that, there are other reasons why the European nation state model doesn't work. State, by definition, for the European, means the institutions of force and violence. So when you take on their model, the first thing you take on is an army and a police and an intelligence section. And you'll tell your people this is for protecting you from your enemies, but there are no enemies to worry about. They're going to invade you. These are being set up by the leaders for the same reason they're set up in the West, to protect the leaders against their own people, because the state is a ripoff operation. Based on John Locke and the Second Treaties of Government, which is the basis for the British Republican system, but even more the American, the French, and others, the role of government is to protect private property. Africans had no conception of private property. Land, air, and water was not private property. Their concept of it was your clothes, your personal wealth, your tools, whatever. Those were yours. But the essential things of life, land, air, and water, are gifts from God, and they're shared by everyone. And that's the basis of the communal ethos. So they couldn't even consider having a government in which the state was used to protect private property, land, air, and water, when it was shared by the people and owned by no one. And the task was to take the land, the air, and water and leave it in better condition than you received it. That was the whole thing that was a part of a guardianship of nature attitude that people had in their relationship to nature. So Africa's burdened by this colonial past, and so the leaders are armed. And the leaders are making decisions that impose violence on the people, and the leaders are wealthy as a general rule. Something that was not allowed under traditional systems. Under the Ghanaian system, the ancient system, a king was decked out in gold and everything else, but when he became king, he had to give up his wealth. And so the gold you saw belonged to the people, wasn't his, you know? And he was held in check by councils. He couldn't make decisions on his own. It was a consensus decision-making that went down there. And then, of course, many societies in Africa had no kings and queens, and those were the most just ones, drawing from all of them the Twa hunter-gatherer societies. So we're burdened by a colonial and enslaved past, and some of our heads are tied up with it. We need to understand that we should not confuse modernization with culture. And so there are some things you need right now, that are new, right? That's good. But it doesn't mean that you take on the culture of your oppressor when you acquire that, So that's part of it. And John and I both shared in that. So this show is very much about drawing from the past as a key to transforming your present and your future. At a turning point in history in which the US is in decline, Europe has declined and fell, and the demographic shift in this country indicates that as we become a majority black, brown, red, and yellow, it means that the dominant majority of this country will no longer be white. And those of us who don't think in terms of power think that means nothing, because we know that there's more to power than numbers. But in this country, as I pointed out before, numbers have been essential. Native Americans got overwhelmed by numbers and technology, but those numbers were essential. And with the shift in numbers, which is numerical power, comes other shifts in power. And this is what we need to be preparing for now. And this is part of what this message is about. So, as you know, I'm a spirit scholar warrior. And so each one of these things means something, and I draw on these in terms of sources for, where I'm going, and the spirit being the most important. And I've been in successful Black liberation movements now for 63 years. I haven't been in any losing ones. That's against my 3W rule. WWW, win, win, win. It's unthinkable to lose, but you can, and I know I can. Every battle that I'm in the future, I don't know if I'll be in any more. I always remind myself, don't think because you won yesterday, you get guaranteed a victory today. Victory is never guaranteed. And the first way to lose is to get arrogant and think, I'm bad. That's how Muhammad Ali lost some of his fights. Playing around with women and not training, getting fat and getting in the ring. He's fighting heavyweights. They don't have to be the best. They got to punch, hit you right. And the older you get, the slower you get, the easier it is to take you out. So, so my stuff has come from the realm of being involved in battles as a warrior that has then led me to scholarship. And at privileged moments, being able to pipe into God's mind, because God's been kind enough, I suppose, to look at me and say, well, he's been working on this for a long time, and he ain't got it yet. So let's help him. And so every now and then, God's been kind enough to let me pipe in to God's mind. And so one of the things I offer in this show is innovative ideas that fall into 5 categories. And one is twinlineal families. And I've only touched on it. And that is explained in my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. A book that took 15 disciplines to write, 5 years to write, the hardest thing I ever did in my life, and the most enjoyable one. I used to think beating the Bank of America, the biggest bank in the world, was my singular accomplishment. Because, corporations run the world. You whip them, that's pretty good. You whip the biggest ones, that's pretty good. And what just me, it was a movement, but it was a strategy we came up with. But then when I wrote this book, this was the hardest thing I ever did, the most enjoyable thing that I've ever done. And anytime it takes 15 disciplines to write a book, and I'm not a master of 15 disciplines, so I also drew on the expertise of others. That's something. But this is Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is trying to return to God what God gave me. God gave me a beautiful insight of male-female empowerment that accurately described the basis for just societies in Africa, particularly based on family systems going back as far as 200,000 years ago. And this is an insight not revealed before. And so one of the things that this show has offered is a vision and model for just family systems, which I call twin lineal, meaning your lineage doesn't come from male alone or female alone, but from males and females, your descent. And that African family systems, as I discovered, are not solely matrilineal, descent from the mother, or patrilineal. But even when descent comes from the mother or the father, they have twin characteristics. And the twin masculine feminine characteristics outweighs the singular ones. And that's across Africa. And similarly, because of this, matriarchies and patriarchies are terms used in anthropological literature, but did not originate in Africa. And so I found that matriarchy and patriarchy do not define what's going on in Africa. So this twin lineal model is one of the things the show offers, and we've only hit the tip of the surface of this. And so anyone that reads Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, this is not a linear book, but chapter 6 goes into detail into this model. So this model is the key to us getting our families together, and families are the key to getting everything together. You know what I'm saying? And this is one that persists in families that work. We just don't put a label on it. They're balanced in different ways. And a lot of our families are balanced, believe it or not. A lot of them aren't, but a lot of them are. And living in an unbalanced situation, you shouldn't be surprised that that would, of course, exist. Even among the most balanced, there's going to be imbalance. So that's one of the things that this show offers, and this is tied into my topic today, Professor John Henry Clarke, the Master Scholar, because this is what John was about. John was about taking the best from the past and using it now. My second innovative breakthrough, and the best ones come from God. Innovation is that domain in anything where you create new schools in the African American context, new schools. In the Dogon system of Sodaya, Sodayyi, that is the highest level, the fourth degree, that is the astrophysics system of the Dogon in its ordered complexity. So a Hogan, who's a priest, may be a master of one part of this system or a few parts of the system, and very few all. It would be almost impossible because their system being based on astrophysics, they're going back to the very origin of the cosmos. So innovation is a realm that 2% in any field experience. John Coltrane was an innovator in music, and you hear me talk many times about George Washington Carver. And people who are innovators generally don't seek to be. That's just something that happens. But it happens with some hard work. But the best part of what happens is when you pipe into God's mind, because always then the innovation is uncovering something that no one's seen before that was already there. Einstein's theory of relativity, we talked about this before. So that's the nature of twin lineal families, is that it's uncovering the fundamental principle of African social organization not understood before. And it puts everything in a different framework when you look at things from that standpoint. And so my second innovation that involved piping into God's mind is when I couldn't figure out, why is our community so messed up? I've gone to this before. I'm not going to go into it today, but I couldn't answer a question of my student. Why is our culture in such a state where it's got a lot of holes in it. And these are younger people. And this was a good 25 years ago that this question was asked, or maybe 30. I didn't have the answer. I gave the wrong answer, realized I didn't have it. And then again, through the beautiful light, without talking, telepathically, God said, the reason we're in this position, and in giving me the diagnosis of the problem, God gave me the answer, is because we're now facing a choice between two cultures. I've gone to this before. Some of you that are new haven't heard it. You need to go back and watch the first show that deals with this, Free the Mind, and other shows, the one with Smalls and others that I deal with this, and read the book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, that explains this. The first chapter is on this. And Dr. Obenga read this when it was in a draft form and said I should write a book on it. And I told him, yeah, that is the first chapter. So what's important about a choice between two cultures is it's the best explanation for the problem that we face now in terms of breakdowns of families and communities, and the weakening of African nations and Caribbean nations, nations like Jamaica, for example. And it provides the best analysis for the solution to these. Because if we're choosing, some of us, to make wrong cultural choices, then it's obvious the answer is making right cultural choices. And so any solutions to any problems we have, be they economic, political, social, whatever, it has to have a cultural component to it. Both African and African American, both. And so, choice between two cultures. And everyone I know that has been exposed to this all come back and say yes. Because when you get something from God, it ain't got no holes in it. If there's any holes, it would be coming from me, not from God. And some people, my wife told me, you tell people this, they're not going to believe you. Some of you don't believe this. Well, I have no reason for lying. First of all, I don't lie. Anyone that knows me knows this. I don't lie. As I told you before I married my wife, that I'm married to, loving wife, Pam Hurley Tashaka, I said, there's one thing I love more than you. Every woman loves to hear this. The truth. And so, I'm grateful for God having shared this with me. And I have to admit, I don't have the brilliance to have come up with this on my own. In the case of the choice between two cultures, it's too much of a mess we're dealing with. So God gave me some clarity. So you'll see a lot of the shows is drawing from this as an overview. We're not repeating ourselves, because this is like a cure for many illnesses, that we face. Dysfunctional families, gentrified communities, communities plagued by drugs and violence and death, and too many of our young people losing hope in their future. This is the key, baby. You hear me? So this show is offering you formats that you can use in your life. You hear me? To empower yourself and your communities, your families, and your people, and not just here, but globally. My other innovations, of which there are 3 others when it comes to thought, grew out of experience in waging successful battles for Black liberation. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Success is a great mother. Failure is also a great teacher. And I'm not knocking anyone that fails. And I've supported many failing movements. I ain't led none of them. They usually call it on me because I'm supposed to be able to, win something. But you brought me in after you made a whole bunch of boo-boos. And then when I come up with, like, the surgeon who's dealing with a patient, and the patient is terminal, but the surgeon's a master. But the surgeon says, we have to do this, 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 and this. And if one thing's not done, this patient's dead. you know. And that's when I'm brought in when something's a mess. That's what I do. And so I'll give them the best scenario, but tell them, depart from this. You're in real trouble. And even with this, I can only give you percentages for your chances for success, because you never know how many mistakes you're allowed to make before you fail. And in the classroom, it's particularly if it's multiple choice, which I didn't do. That's crapshoot. You got to use your brain. So a professor may have only so many errors they're going to allow. Of course, it's really subjective. So don't think they're really being that objective. But in life, you just don't know where you just goofed up too much. So I've supported some losing battles, but I tried to help. So you learn from your mistakes. So I'm not knocking anybody that has been knocked down, because as a people, we've been knocked down. So we got to learn and get ourselves up. But you're in a window period now where Asia has rose. Africa rose to independence. And once we clear up some of this befuddlement from colonialism and us here, slavery, and the Caribbean, colonialism and slavery, we're going to get our act together. You hear me? We're going to get it together. And you're going to have to go black to the future, as the hip hoppers say. You know what I mean? Black to the future. So my third area of innovation that you've heard me repeat before, but I'm doing this because I want to show what this show's about. Why we're presenting things in a certain way. And this third one comes from engaging in battles for liberation and realizing that my mind was incarcerated, in prison, under lockdown. Here we are in a Black freedom movement and a Black power movement, and we're thinking our enemy's thoughts. At least I was. And so the sixfold stages to mental freedom is an experience. And it's an experience that a Malcolm X, Amilcar Cabral, Theophilo Benga, Ella Baker, and many others of our people have gone through, and too many have not. And that's a major reason why some of our movements in the 60s went down, particularly because their leaders had not undergone this or only partially underwent it. So the sixfold stages to mental freedom is the curative for freeing your minds, and best experienced when you're in a winning movement. Best experienced because there you're especially going to experience a healing. Comes in part from kicking your enemies behind. But in large measure, it comes from overcoming the brainwashing that has put us in psychological, mental, historical servitude, and breaking free of that. And that's the real healing. A lot of us want easy healing where we can just go into a corner and be quiet and everything will be all right. Nah, that's good. Meditation is good. I'm not knocking it. But you got to do some self-cultivation. You got to work on your inner garden. And in this particular case, your identity. And the key to anything being good in your life is loving yourself, knowing yourself, and respecting yourself. And all the other loves come from that. You can't even love God if you don't love yourself, because God's inside of you. You know what I mean? So the sixfold stages to mental freedom. This show was started so that it could be like a foundation basis for the operation of the show. I consulted some of the people in Pan-African People's Organization, which is the successor organization of the Congress of Racial Equality that still operates in San Francisco. I formed it in 1966. And the most memorable experience that people who have joined, and some are still a part of this organization, have gone through has been the sixfold stages to mental freedom, which has been tied to work. because this only works when you're doing something in your community. So I consulted with members of Pan-African People's Organization who are leaders. And one in particular, Thabiti Mtambuzi, who I'm going to have on this show, a former student of mine, had been a straight A student in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, wanted to be an astronaut. He only told me this, I mentioned this about a few months ago. He only told me this about a year ago, that he was going to space until I brought him down to earth. And he's one of the real leaders in our organization, and he's a businessman. He's a millionaire. That's what he wanted to be. He told me that. He's good at business, but he helps people with this stuff. But all his children have gone through our school. His grandchild just gone through it. So I consulted with him and others and said, do you think this will work on the internet? And said, yeah. Because the main thing is you have time. And then the question is, what are people going to do with this? So it's a question of people's commitment. So if you're committed to uplifting your community and working on yourself, then yeah, we can do something, And so the sixfold stages to mental freedom is like at the foundation. It's the bedrock of the show, in that what we're trying to do is trigger higher awakening, higher transformation. So we'll be doing, and I have to go into the file and check and see how many more we still need. Once we have 40 people who have signed up for the Free the Mind, Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom webinar, which will be going on for a year, twice a month, we'll start it. Of course, I have to have prep time to get together, because the number of people in Pan-African People's Organization that have gone through this over the last 50 years and have applied this in raising their children in the prison industrial complex, in various walks of life, in community organizing, personally in their own lives, they'll be helping in this process. So this is a key thing. This is about promoting self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-love. This is the ultimate healer. And I stress again, it doesn't heal from things that you need professional help for: schizophrenia, paranoia, depression. You need some special help for that. We're not claiming that we can heal that. We cannot. Healing work. Can someone confirm how we sign up again? Yeah, you can sign up again to be safe. Just send me an email, otshaka@sbcglobaldebt.net, OTSHAKA at sbcglobal.net, and just let me know that you want to be a part of this, But I have a file. If you send them, you're in the file. But if you want to be sure it's right, then do that. So that's the second innovation. The third innovation. The fourth innovation is one that you found through a lot of shows that have focused on the Chwa and the Anu. It's a new school of world history. And I've been doing some research lately that ties this together. And I can't say what that is, because when I'm onto something new, there's only one or two people that know about it. But I'm just giving you an overall picture. And what you see when you look at the Chwa series that we did, the Anu series that we've done, the twin lineal family stuff we've done, this is providing a new school of history, because we're bringing in the founding people of civilization, the world's first people, the Chwa, and also known as Kun, because they are literally the first, according to mitochondrial DNA, coming out of the Kalahari Desert. And then the Anu people, who are the founders of ancient Kemet. So as you know, my focus is on pre-dynastic, ancient Kemet, though I know dynastic, because I'm focusing on what hasn't been covered. And so this is at least 130,000 years of human history as much as 200,000 years, where for most of that time, the formula that people live by, and you only hear this from me, but I've proven this. If you read Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, I established it. These were societies that operated on the principle, and it started in Africa, but Native Americans operate on the same principle. People in the South Pacific operate on the same principle. Asians operated on the same principle at one point. They operated on this principle that God revealed through the beautiful light, where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. That describes a whole lot, you know? So this show is a revolutionary show, but revolutionary in a different sense. We're drawing from the best of our roots that promote human well-being, justice, happiness, love, and a good life, as formulas for how you can apply things to your life right now. This is the key thing about these models, is these are not 200 years from now models like, say, the Marxist system is basically a system to replace an existing system. So you got to wait for this system to be overthrown or something. This is something you can apply in your life right now by living it, by speaking it, by thinking it, by internalizing it. And it will empower you now, you know. You don't need to wait until this society's fully free to free your mind. In fact, it's going to take a free mind to free not only your behind, but the behinds in this society. You got to promote that kind of freedom. And it's only when you think you can't that you won't. As you think, so you are, you know. Your thoughts really define reality. And in this case, a free mind is a key to all of it. So when Lao Tzu made the comment, and I think he was doing it to bring clarity, he said, we can't go back to the hunter-gatherer stage. And I assume that he raised that question for clarity. Of course, some of us would say that because, yeah, it's real nice, no slavery, no oppression of women, you know what I mean? Everybody could eat. But hey, man, living out in the bush, running around hunting, you know what I mean? And gathering and that kind of stuff. No good rags to wear, no car to drive, no skyscrapers. Are you kidding? Well, actually, I drive a car. I told you I drive a sports car. That's me. I'm cool, baby. A Corvette. It's red too. And I don't care what anybody thinks about it. I get some real good feelings when I hear those pipes and when I hit those corners. That's me. It's the only kind of car I like to drive. But it's polluting. So sooner or later, when they come up with an appropriate engine, I'll drop an electric one in there. You know what I mean? So modernizing doesn't mean that you have to go back to the exact circumstances. That's what I started this off with. But if people could live in societies free of oppression for most of human history, don't tell me it's not possible when you're using dysfunctional models right now that are messing up the planet. You complain about it, fight against it, and continue to live under it. And some think there's nothing else that's an alternative to it. And that's because that's what you think. So that's the point of this show. And so today we're living under an unjust society, and all the world is living under unjust societies. And so Adam Smith's system of private ownership of wealth is basically what governs the system of capitalism, based on the blood coming from our enslaved brothers and sisters. And there's still slavery going on in the world today, So you have models for sharing. Are you going to tell me they're useless? We had brothers and sisters who would die for the Soviet version or the Chinese version until they became, decided to become capitalists, that they die for their version, not looking at the fact that Stalin was out there killing more people than probably Hitler killed, or at least as many, and talking about, this is revolution. But when it comes to your own stuff, we got trouble with it. It won't work. Who says it won't work? It worked for most of your existence. And the only reason why it's not working right now is that they got a system here to see that it doesn't come into being. And by the way, if this is such a lame system, you explain to me why it was when Madison wrote the Federalist Papers, he said one of the reasons why, you needed a Republican government that could control the people. And then he said control itself, because if you don't have that, the people will equitably distribute the wealth. The last time I heard, that's communalism. He talking about white people, because at that point they had no idea that blacks, brown, red, or yellow people should share in anything, that we were even people. And some of them still don't have that idea. So that would tell you something. Not only is your system something that you could bring back, adapt to modern circumstances, but that if most humans had a choice, that's what they would do. Think about that one. Think about that one. So we're living under something that only works for very few people. Don't tell me that you can't begin to conceive of something that will work for everybody, especially for all of our people. And a key thing to this is to understand that we have more power than we think we have. And I'm getting into John Henrik Clarke. John Henrik Clarke, one of his central focuses on history was power, and that's why he identified with his great-great-grandfather, Buck. He was a powerful African. That's what set him on his course. Grandma Mary talking about a proud, powerful black man that took no mess. He identified Africa with power. You hear me? And so when we're looking at our situation today, we need to understand we have some power. And we're always into woe is me. And I keep saying on this show, every time we get a victory, we act like we didn't have one. You don't talk about it. There's no celebration. You kick Trump's behind and you act like nothing happened. And then put down the people that did it. Black Lives Matter. You hear me? And then just treat Biden like it's nothing. I'm no Biden a lover. I would have preferred someone other than Biden. And any of them wouldn't have been good enough. None of them good enough for me. I'm revolutionary. But the fact is, I also recognize the wisdom of black folks. And black folks had concluded Trump had to go. And it wasn't just black folks. A lot of brown and red and yellow people concluded the same thing. And in fact, in Arizona, which would normally be a Republican state, it was Mexicans, Latinos, and Native Americans that kicked his behind, because that's conservative country, And so that was a victory. And that's because you have some power. But you need to know your levels of power. And one of yours is your strategic position. Your power as blacks in the United States is based on location. You are within the house of global oppression. You're in the nerve center. That's why when Garvey started his movement, it could spread all over the world, because this was a strategic nerve center, and it could reach out to a Ho Chi Minh and inspire him to go back to Vietnam to free his people. That's why when we were leading the San Francisco Freedom Movement and we brought in some shock troops from UC Berkeley and from San Francisco State students, along with Black community members, after a year of struggling for jobs in the San Francisco freedom movement, those students went back to UC Berkeley and started a free speech movement because of the strategic location of the Black freedom, Black power movement, that when it produces change for itself, it inspires other people and produces change within them. And so those students said they were radicalized by this movement, and it spread across the country. White students trying to control their universities. You understand? You're in a strategic position. And when you had someone on this show like the Minister of Culture, Emory Douglas, of the Black Panther Party, saying when the Black Panthers went into motion, it encouraged young Native American freedom fighters to form a group called AIM, American Indian Movement, because you're in the strategic position where you cause chain reactions. That's your power. So it's a question of what you decide to do with it, because you have the popular culture of choice of the world. What do you decide to do with it? And so you got to think long-term and short-term, not just short-term. And as you do that, you will put forces into motion. And those forces will go into motion because they're inspired by the justness of your cause and by your strategic position. So today's show will utilize Professor John Henrik Clarke's life as a scholar to show how African and African American culture shaped masters in all domains of life, focusing specifically on John Henrik Clarke and the scholarly life. See, again, here we are, we create a new African culture during enslavement and an art form. We had the luxury to create an art form because for us, beauty is essential to life. And we had the luxury to create scholarship. But that's not really a luxury, no more than beauty is, because beauty is a necessity of life. Because everything God created has beauty to it. And so you want to bring it in. And the average Black person is the master of beauty. They're into beautification. It used to be when we had shacks, you know what I mean? Sharecropping and stuff. You go into those shacks, and Blacks did everything they could to beautify it. That's why George Washington Carver created paints that would last 30 and 40 years. His favorite one I pointed out before, Egyptian blue. So he could bring beauty where there's ugliness, you know? So beauty for us is a necessity of life. And the most important beauty is the beauty of character. And then the beauty of creativity, which we're all put here to do. You know what I mean? And so scholarship is also a necessity, you know, because when you have scholars whose heads are wrapped on right, then they can do some things that deal with looking ahead. They can help prepare us for things to come. And so a John Henrik Clarke is an example of someone who comes out of the mud of sharecropping, experienced many days of hunger, and even when he comes to New York, is doing menial jobs. Whatever job he got, he doing. And then after the job was done, he was hitting a book. Huh? Because he knew what his destiny was, you know? So I'm using John Henrik Clarke as an example of how this culture has shaped brilliance at many levels, because we got all kinds of brilliance, you know. The mechanic who can listen to an engine and tell you what's wrong with it. Now that's some real brilliance. You hear me? I don't care what the person's job is or avocation may be, the one that brings something that's excellent to it. And that's generally been our attitude towards life, though some of that excellence is is in decline now. Some of us satisfied for mediocre, but so this discussion is Professor John Henry Clarke, the Master Scholar. It's about the systems that we carried from Africa to America and reformed here that shape the highest systems of mastery on the planet. It's about how John Henry Clarke was sculpted by his community and the love that his community had for him, by his family and extended family community, into a master scholar and a wonderful human being. And these two went together. And this is, again, a part of the African tradition. The excellence of character is what really determines whether we are dedicated to the truth. And if we are trying to be the truth, then the wisdom is going to come from that. And whatever the truths are that we're here to pursue, because that has to do with our own special gifts. So you don't have to be no scholar to apply this to yourself, because it's whatever your light is, whatever your roadway is in life, that you need to be conscious of. If you are, then do your very best to master it. Take it to the highest level you can take it to. Be the best you can be. So my fifth innovation was based on seeing that the Dogon and the African American mastery systems are the same. And I've gone through some of this before. So I'm going to focus on Professor John Henry Clarke and how this worked in his life. And this is a part of what I'm covering in my new book on Seba that I'm working on. The last week I've been polishing the first chapter. It's an introductory piece. So I've been polishing, because you want your stuff to shine. You know what I mean? My discovery that the Dogon system of 4 degrees, Jiri-So, Beni-So, Bolo-So, and Sodaya, is the same as the 3 levels in the African American system: imitation, improvisation, and innovation. That came again through experience. And in this case, as I underwent an awakening, I realized that I had not only been miseducated by being misinformed, and so I had to reschool myself in history and culture and other things and do my homework and internalize it at the same time in the midst of battles. But I also realized that the people who had been teaching me weren't only teaching me wrong facts, but the wrong way. And the wrong way was they didn't have a way of transmitting mastery. They weren't masters of their own stuff. And of course, had I followed that, I'd have been in a world of trouble. But I realized that as I discovered who I am and was, that I'm an African, but then I realized an African with certain, inclinations. Like, I'm good at fighting, I'm a warrior, okay? How do I master this? I'm an organizer. How do I master this? Public speaker. How do I master this? I'm a strategist. How do I master this? So then I was drawn to masters who matched me, but were at a higher level. I wanted to be the best I could be. And so my first master was Marcus Garvey. And it's interesting, at the time I wake up, which is 1963, a book comes out on Marcus Garvey by a guy named Cronin. I mentioned this in some previous shows. It was not a very good book, but that's not how we saw it then, because a lot of us had never heard of Garvey. Now, Kwame Ture had. His people came from Trinidad. He was in New York. You in New York, you're going to hear about Garvey. but a lot of us had not. And so when I'm reading this book, I'm saying, wow, look what he did. Whoa. Biggest organization blacks had built in the Western Hemisphere. One focused on independence and grounded in African history, you know? And so that became my first master. He died in 1940. I was born in 1939. So this tells you something else about this system that John Henry Clarke came up under. It's an apprenticeship system, but it can be a direct or indirect. In this case, Garvey was a master who I mastered indirectly. In other words, he wasn't around for me to see and draw from, but I drew from his writings. I drew from the historical example of him. I read everything on Garvey I could get my hands on. You know, I've talked to people about this before. So he was my first master. And then after a number of years, there are other things. Garvey had the organizing thing. He had the institution building. He had a global outlook, though he never used the word Pan-Africanism. He was practicing Pan-Africanism, you know. And Garvey had his shortcomings too. And I saw some of those, but his strengths were what I wanted to draw from. And in CORE, we led mass movements and the only successful Black freedom movement in the country. But we didn't do institution building. And so I learned institution building from him, how to build businesses, economic development, you know. And we're both Leos. By nature, I'm self-reliant. That's why I finance this show, but I need help. Leos, the sun rules us, so we think that we're self-sufficient. Nobody really is, but it's an illusion. You know, Garvey had that illusion. I sometimes operate on it. I know better, you know what I mean? But still, that's an illusion. So Garvey was my first master. But then as I began to master Garvey, and after I leave the Congress of Racial Equality, form the Pan-African People's Organization, we do institution building, build housing and stuff, and do various things. I realized other things I need to know. And Malcolm had that. Malcolm was a deep thinker. He stood on Garvey, you know, his family of Garveyites. So I pointed out, my goatee, I wear it because Malcolm wore a goatee. I used to talk like Malcolm. I wrote like Malcolm. My first 2 or 3 drafts of the political legacy of Malcolm X, when I had Jacob Carruthers, who became one of my masters, a beautiful master, by the way, a little guy, tough. One of his favorite words when he's dealing you a dose of stuff that you'd be saying, oh, hell, he'd say, you asked for it, didn't you? Because Jake actually believed that most Blacks, particularly scholars, didn't want any criticism. I always ask him for the criticism. So when I gave him what was probably the second or third draft of the political legacy of Malcolm X, he said, I can't tell where Malcolm ends and you begin. And that was because I was so engrossed in Malcolm. That was clear indication I need to work more on that book. But I had to work more on myself. But in that first stage, you're imitating. So I was imitating Malcolm. I don't anymore. Hadn't found my voice. But I was imitating certain qualities of his, and particularly his ability to be a deep creative thinker. I really appreciated that. And then he had the other qualities that we were also working on, which is being incorruptible and not caring about material things as being the primary thing, but the people coming first and stuff like that. So Malcolm was my second master. And so while I'm going through this apprenticeship thing and undergoing an awakening, going through different stages of awakening, 6-fold stages to mental freedom, I'm studying Dogon philosophy and internalizing some fundamental principles of the cosmos that is really transforming me and preparing me for my life crisis that I've talked about before. 5 years, 3 months, a year, retreating, going out in nature and looking at myself, 3 months for 15 months over 5 years. That was self-cultivation work. But Dogon philosophy was helping me with that. And then African-American philosophy, because these two had to work together. So I'm explaining this to say that's how I got to realize that the Dogon and African American system are the same by going through it. And I've explained before how Walter Bishop's explanation of the guiding path to mastery in the African American mastery system of imitation, improvisation, and innovation, that was an eye opener because it helped me better explain what I had been going through in the Dogon system. So in 1995, Return to the African Mother Principle was finished. And I went to see Professor John Henry Clarke in Harlem. He had a brownstone, pretty much like the brownstone that Bill Cosby had on the Cosby Show. But I'm not citing him. I know the wrong he's done, you know. But as I pointed out before, Bill Cosby donated money so John could get a reading machine. And in fact, this book, My Life in Search of Africa, which was 3 lectures delivered by Professor John Henry Clarke at Cornell University, he dedicates these 3 lectures, which is a book put together by Professor James Turner, who had been chair of Black Studies at Cornell. He's a man I knew, he's a good man. And he had hired both John and Doc Ben to teach at Cornell, and was also the chair of the 6th Pan-African Congress Committee, where I chaired the section for North America dealing with politics. He was the overall chair of that. He's a very good man. And so this book is dedicated to the Cosbys for donating this reading machine. Because by this time, John was blind. So when I go to see John, by then I'd made the discovery that these 2 systems are the same. So I'm explaining to him this system and the Dogon and African American system of 4 degrees Dogon, 3 levels African American. And John's response was, "That's so complex. How are you going to explain that?" How are you going to explain that? So the last 8 months of John's life, as I've told you before, for some of you that have seen the show, others, this is new. I interviewed John on the Masters in his life. And I think John, before he passed on, figured it out. Oh, he's going to use me to help explain this. And 5 other masters, like Theophilo Benga, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker, and some others, you know. John Coltrane, that was one of my most enjoyable explorations and most difficult, you know. So I think by the end, he figured this one out, you know. Oh, you're going to use me to explain this. Darn right. I'm going to use great masters, you know what I mean? So John Henry Clarke gave 3 lectures at Cornell University between March 27th through March 29th, 1990. And again, this is the booklet, My Life in Search of Africa. I received a call from one of my masters, Jacob Carruthers, and he had called me because I had been telling him about the Dogon African American mastery system. And so he had been considering it. And then he read this book and he said, "Oh, this is what you've been talking about." And I had already read the book. I said, "Yeah, John's a perfect example of this mastery system." So I had shared this with Asa Hilliard before, but Jacob Carruthers seeing this was important, that he could see manifested in the life of his master, because John Henry Clarke was Jacob Carruthers' master as well. and I think one of his prized apprentices, Jacob Carruthers. So last week, I discussed the three deities that John Henrik Clarke had in his life, all female. His great-grandmother, Ma Mary, his mother, who died when he was 7 years old, and Miss Evelina Taylor, his fifth grade teacher. Now, John was a great appreciator of Black women and of African women. And John talked a lot about the Big Mama system among Black people. And because he was a product of African American culture, he talked about how Big Mamaism worked in the church. He said, Big Mama controlled the deacons. The deacons controlled the preacher. These were the old days when it was operating on an elder system. And the preachers, when they went home, they got some direction from their big mamas, their wives. In fact, if you look at Martin Luther King, he had a very strong father, except for one thing. His mother ruled him. Now, this ain't true with all Black men, don't get it wrong, but Big Mamaism is a part of this Black goddess system John Henrik Clarke used to talk about. And he used to talk about how the Black goddess system could happen among African people because we could worship African women as goddesses because we were secure in our identity. These Black women didn't put us down. These Black women supported us. Just as these three deities, all Black women, put John on his course. They were encouraging him to be the best human being he could be, And so Big Mamaism, that's a Queen Mother tradition. You understand? Then among the Asante, the last thing the Asante Hina, the king, does before he goes to bed is consult the Queen Mother. The first thing he does when he gets his black butt up in the morning is consult the Queen Mother. Before he's installed, it's the council of the nation made up of lineage heads, opinions, the most just people who head up the lineage, and the Queen Mother. And he's not installed until he's schooled in leadership. And the most important schooling comes from the Queen Mother. And when council is held, that is, when the king sits in council, he can't sit unless the queen sits. And the queen is not his mother. That would be a conflict of interest. And she is charged with the responsibility to call him out if he's wrong. You hear me? This is a tradition that Africans carried into the United States. And by the way, as I pointed out before, we carried in the secret society traditions, of which the master and the master system of the Dogon African American and other mastery systems of Africa were carried. That was the basis for Pur'an, House of Life, the highest educational system, university system in ancient Kemet. They drew from these inter-African systems called secret societies. And the secret societies came into being during the colonial era as a means for continuing to pass on African traditions when it was under attack, when Europeans were trying to take over African societies and therefore displacing African educational systems with European ones. And so one of the things brought into the Americas, including the United States, was this apprenticeship system through the Poro Society, which was the largest of the secret societies in West Africa. People from Sierra Leone and others came out of that. Senku, who led the rebellion on the Amistad ship, a successful rebellion. was one of many warriors who were members of the Poro Society. When they sliced the throats of those whites who were trying to enslave them on that ship. And then you had the secret societies during enslavement, the Loyal League, which was a spy system, which was a system that was constantly plotting for freedom. And it was a system that both free men and women of color belonged to, as well as enslaved Africans. Martin R. Delaney was a member of the Loyal League. I've talked about this in a previous show. So that John Henry Clarke comes up under an apprenticeship system of mastery that had been carried into the Americas, into the Caribbean, into South America, and into the United States. Prince Hall brought it when he brought in his secret society, the African Lodge, from Barbados, the land where my wife and her people come from, you know. And later that becomes the Prince Hall Masons, but again, secret societies. So John inherits this particular tradition. And the key thing to get straight is African-American culture, not only through the apprenticeship system, but this whole sense of excellence that pervades the culture was what set John on his course. And so his grandmother teaches him about the greatness of Africa and the courage of Africans and the bravery of his grandfather, great-grandfather Buck, you know. And so he has this high view of Africa. And then the most important influence on him after his grandmother in terms of dealing with Africa is his teacher, Elvina Taylor, who encourages him to do greatness. And it was John who referred to this. So I want to quote him. He says, "I've had 3 deities in my life, all women. My great-grandmother, my mother, who died when I was 7, and Miss Evelina Taylor. And every time I tried to get into mischief, I'd imagine one of those women looking over my shoulder saying, tapping me on the arm, you know, the sister who say, you ain't supposed to be doing that, boy. That's not nice, John. You know you shouldn't do that. That's kept me out of temptation. And I'm glad they did, because I'm a better human being, because they set a standard for me and made me set a standard for myself. And my human relationships with both men and women have been better because of it. A standard of integrity was set for me. It was Miss Taylor's room. It was in her room that I decided, listen to this, to do something exceptional. You hear me? That's the sense of excellence that pervades the culture. It was stronger then. It's still strong now. It's in your culture. It comes out of the race consciousness of our people. And it comes out of realizing that we're all endowed with powers, and that what we need to do is have confidence in ourselves to draw from those powers. So John was inspired by the humanism of Black culture coming out of Africa. And that is at the core of everything, because John was, first of all, about being nice, about being a good human being, about being truthful, about being kind. And so humanism is a constituent part of the African and the new African's nature, though some of us have heavily departed from that. We have some monsters now. In this choice between two cultures era, that song in the 60s, Smiling Faces, conceal the evil that lurks within smiling faces, you know? You got some people who are smiling now, but it's not coming from the heart of the soul. You hear me? Because of this choice between two cultures, some of us have fallen into the pit of degradation. Some of us have. Of greed, of individualism, where anything comes before human life. So I'm not dealing in dream world, but the fact is, the majority of our people still draw from this. And this is what made a John Henrik Clarke not be satisfied with just being average. He wanted to be exceptional. He wanted to do something that would make Miss Evelina Taylor smile. You hear me? Now that's a Black man who really loves himself and loves his people. You hear me? And in the spirit world, they say, realize this: everything you do, there are eyes on you. So it's not just the Miss Evelina Taylors in our life, but it's the spirits up there watching us. John had a sense of that because he was a deeply spiritual human being. So last week, I was focusing on, how the culture shaped this great human being, and how this extended family community, total culture that cared for you, that John talked about, through his grandmother, drew from a core foundational principle of the culture, which is Africa. And so John, at an early age, had his mind focused on Africa through what was very little that his grandmother had to say. But what she had to say about Africa that was so important was his family's connection to Africa. The bravery, the courage of Africa. You hear me? And it came through one of his three female deities, Big Mama. Of course, by 108 years of age, I doubt if she was all that big, but she was big in every other way. Big voice. She had her a big cane that when she pronounced the statement, like she saw Sherman's armies and she saw Sherman's red eyes. And when a family member would say, "Grandma, you didn't see his red eyes," she would pound down with her walking stick and say, "Yes, I did." And John said the Supreme Court had just announced its verdict and nobody else had anything else to say. That's another thing about Big Mamaism. Big Mamaism isn't always democratic. Big Mama, because if Big Mama is raising your behind, Big Mama ain't saying, "Let's have a vote on whether or not you get a whipping." A whipping's coming. You know what I mean? And you heard my critique on whippings. We do too much. We need to get away from it and blah, blah. But the fact is, Big Mama, by the way, when we talk about secret societies that brought in the mastery systems along with other systems that brought it as well, Big Mama was in every male secret society, but there were no males in any sister's secret society. Because your mama's got some secrets you don't know about, boy, what you asking that for? You ever heard that? So this is looking at how this culture coming out of secret societies and other areas of Black life shaped master scholars. And in this case, master professors and a master human being. And in this case, John Henrik Clarke. So this is also making another point, because we started this thing off on African-American culture by showing how the culture was recreated in the US, whereas it was just dropped in the Caribbean because you were 98%, you just continue what you had. Here there was a war waged for us to continue this culture and recreate it. So we created a new African one with African principles rearranged, and then new principles like race consciousness, Pan-Africanism that are brought in. And then we had to fight the influences of the enslaved mentality, which we still have to fight. Looking at the prevalence of the N-word and a host of other things, yeah, that seep into the minds and govern the minds of too many of our people. You know what I mean? That word's not permitted on this show. And in fact, it's a state of mind. So when you see that coming out, the N-word coming out, it's reflecting a state of mind of nothingness. I don't care how African that person says they are. If that's their normal discourse, they're revealing what they think of themselves. And until your thought pattern changes, that nothingness attitude, which is what that N-word signifies, will prevail, you know? So 50 Cent, his concept of power is a drug dealer on the corner. And in this particular case, because he's reproducing, theatrically his own experience, the mother who turns out her own son. And in one of the series, gives him the assignment to kill his own father, not knowing that it's his father, And it's great acting, it's great writers and stuff, but this is the limit of your vision? Come on, man. You ain't doing that anymore. You got some other ideas of what power is? Because that ain't no power. Having you some drug money. I told you, when I took over the poverty program, I put so many millions of dollars into the Fillmore, I couldn't even count it, and I didn't take a penny of it. When we built the King Garvey complex, I got 4 square blocks of land. It was worth a couple of $100 million. I didn't even think about pocketing it. Now that's some power. You hear me? This is your vision? Being a successful drug dealer. And then the best of the vision is who kills so many people, he can kill his way out and become legitimate. Become the mob, the successful mob, America is the successful mob. They've exterminated everything in sight. And so they've made illegitimate legitimate, if you want to follow that model. So when we're looking at Professor Clarke, his focus was on how we empower ourselves through drawing from the best of our history. And he was able to come to some deep conclusions because he himself began to come up under masters who helped him become a better human being and the best that he could be as a master. He always said it wasn't a question of being better than someone else, but to be his best. And in fact, he would recount a situation after he had become blind and he was depressed and everything else. And he saw Thurgood Marshall on television. He was walking up the stairs of his house and he stopped and listened. And they asked Thurgood Marshall, the Black justice on the Supreme Court, they asked him, what would you say about your life? And John said, I'd say only this. I did the best with what I had. And he had quite a bit. He was a hell of a legal mind, And John said, it caused me to think. Here I am. I come from sharecropping. I come from a family where the only book we had in the house was a Bible. I came from a situation where my family could only send one person in the family to go to school because if you were in the rural area, only one child would be allowed to go to school. And I came from a situation where I was often poor and I had to shine shoes. When he came to New York, he was doing menial work and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And then look what I've done with my life. And so he said, it gave me courage. He said, he realized he had been doing his best and he needed to keep on doing it. You hear me? Blind or not. And of course, it hurt him because he lost the most precious thing to him because John was a reader. You hear me? And not to be able, a library of 25,000 books, not to be able to go through those books, that would be like a runner losing a leg. You hear me? So it picked him up, this sense of doing your best. So in starting this series off, I was showing how we recreated a culture here, added new elements to it, and showing what a magnificent culture this is that we've carried from Africa and recreated here, rooted in spirit, humanism, democracy, freedom, improvisation, communal sharing, extended family communities that shaped him, a hieroglyphic word-based culture, a race-conscious and Pan-Africanist culture, new additions we made here. We carried this from Africa to here, recreated it. Great magnificence, under fire, you know? So, for those who want to argue we lost our culture in slavery, you can't. Look at all of this. But how are you going to say that when you carried in the crown jewel of all, the jewel of mastery? And this mastery is tied not just to technical excellence, but human excellence. And not all our masters meet both standards. Not all our musicians are the best human beings, but a lot are. But some are not, because of the corrupting influence of this environment. But John, and many like him, there was no separation between the wisdom that they sought to acquire and their characters. One was the basis for the other. And that character had been shaped in his community, had been shaped by his culture, had been shaped by the big mamas in his life. And we have to acknowledge the big mamas. I've told you about mine. When the CIA came after me, you know, big mama was Ray Richardson. Co-owner Marcus Bookstore. And at the time, I had also got married. And she said, the man needs a job. Got me a job. And then the FBI saw that I couldn't keep the job and I could have beat him, but the Spirit said, don't even fight it. I've never got that message before. And I didn't. And then 3 years later, she's got me out to San Francisco State, Big Mama. And then a sister named Nansisi Caillou, who was chair of the dance department, my good friend at San Francisco State. She was really running Black Studies at that time. I'm at our headquarters, Malcolm X Unity House, which I had bought and given to the organization. The organization paid off the mortgage, but I put the down payment on it, 5,800 square foot rehab, beautiful palace. And the hall where we met in was Marcus Garvey Hall. And then the Unity House was called the Malcolm X Unity House. We ran food programs there, fed thousands of people. We run a school that's still operating and so forth and so on. So one day, because every Sunday we'd have these meetings, 200-300 people. We could pack a couple of hundred in Garvey Hall and the rest of them upstairs. We had a sound system for it. And so here comes a guy named Njasani. And Njasani is acting chair of Black Studies. He's from South Africa. But the people really running Black Studies is Ray Richardson and Nansisi Caillou, big mamas. And so he asked me, you want to teach at San Francisco State? I never thought of teaching at San Francisco State. I said, yeah. And then the FBI came after me again. And we beat them with the help of Asa Hilliard. I pointed this out for some people that heard the show before, who was in charge of my HRT committee, hiring, retention, and tenure committee. That's the one that once you get approved on that, you're in for life, unless you murder somebody or something. You know what I mean? And Asa was the one that really went to bat for me, the only Black dean at San Francisco State, covering my back. That would be a big brother in my life. He was maybe 2 or 3 years older than me, but a loving, kind man. I've had my brothers that look out for me too, So I've had my big mamas. And of course, my mother, and Ella Hill Hutch, the mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. So I've had these sisters that have been in my corner. Why? They love them some strong black men. And if they see you're standing up for right, you're standing up for the truth, they're backing you up. You hear me? Every black community's got their big mamas, and they got their brothers also who will back you up. Do right, and you'll find them, you know? So this mastery system operates on a principle that when the novice is ready, the master appears. And one of the things about the mastery system is that for a novice to be able to apprentice under a master, they need to show humility. They need to show respect. But most importantly, they must be open to this process. And so John Henrik Clarke, in working in school as a part of the Black Brigade, you know, again, the color complex coming out of slavery, the dark-skinned students had to do the physical work. The light-skinned students didn't. And they had light-skinned teachers. And John was very happy that he was dark enough to get Miss Evelina Taylor. That was his roadway to heaven, you know. And one day, while he's doing his Black Brigade work, which means sweeping and cleaning and all the other things, you know, he runs into a brother. This brother had a book. His name was Jones. And he had a book. And John was holding both his jacket and his book. And John had been looking for evidence of the greatness of African people. And so he has a book that's called The New Negro, which was the term being used then during the Cultural Renaissance and afterwards. And King would use the same term to describe awakening Blacks in the 50s and 60s, and Garvey described the Africans who supported him as the new Negro, the awakened person. And so he thumbs through this book, and there's a chapter entitled "The Negro Digs Up His Past," and it's by Arthur Schomburg. And Schomburg is on this promotional that you have right here. Arthur Schomburg. It will come to him in a minute. And so John asked Mr. Jones, could he read the book? And he said, yeah. And so he reads the article, "The Negro Digs Up His Past." Arthur Schomburg is a African American, a Puerto Rican descent. And so when he reads this article, it's the first proof that John has that we have a great African past, because everything around him, all he got was from his grandmother. When he went to church, he got Jesus is white. Everything is white, you know? And so what happens is he's discovering in "The Negro Digs Up His Past" that Africans were here before whites. This was a very important revelation for John. He said it made him smug. He said he started looking at whites differently. He started to think, well, poor things, you've just been around for a short period of time. You hear me? He was learning that every people had went through slavery, and a lot longer than we had. And he was learning about the great civilizations that Africans had created. And so this was his first real proof of the greatness of Africa, and that really set him on his course. So until he finishes high school, he's apprenticing indirectly under Arthur Schoenberg. Arthur Schoenberg becomes his first master. And under the Dogon system, Jiriso master, the one he imitates. He would have another one as well. So thing about Arthur Schoenberg is that he matches certain qualities that John has. And so he's drawn to a master similar to him, but one who's a master. First, Schoenberg was someone who had been trained by master scholars himself. Schoenberg didn't have a college education. He didn't have a PhD. He was trained by masters under this African-American mastery apprenticeship system. And so his master had been James Bruce, who was a columnist, wrote articles in black newspapers, and his column was called Bruce's Grit, G-R-I-T. Bruce trained George Schuler. George Schuler was at one time a radical, later became a conservative, but he was the master under whom Ella Baker apprenticed under. And James Bruce helped polish Marcus Garvey, made him a little bit more presentable. He was a master scholar. And so John Henry Clarke was coming up under the apprenticeship of a master who had been trained by masters as John would be, not through college, but through the university of the community, made up of master scholars. So this system of apprenticeship would prove to be superior to Western educational systems because, first of all, it's a total system. And so as John apprenticed under Arthur Schoenberg and then other masters, John was getting not just an intellectual education, but a spiritual education and an education that affected his whole life. And so it was a mind, body, spirit transformation that you don't get in higher miseducation in the Western world, that can only teach to one domain of the person, which is the mind. So in Africa, the master in the master system produces generally generalists who have depth. And Arthur Schoenberg was a generalist on African history and world history, and John Henry Clarke would describe himself as a generalist who knew the general history of Africa and knew a lot about different parts of Africa, but didn't specialize in one. And then what he got from Schoenberg was the connection of African history to world history. And this is an important thing because John was always locating African history within the context of the world. And for him, the world he was looking at was primarily the world of Europe. And so when I'm apprenticing under John, I'm a mature scholar. And so I have my concentrations. They're in European history, African history, African American history, European American history, Mexican history, Chinese history. So I have a variety of focuses, but I'm drawn to John because we both have this global kind of interest. And then John has a depth far greater than mine. And he had come up under masters that came through New York. And then he also met when he traveled to Africa in 1958 and lived with the people. And he was exposed to so many African masters we've never heard of. And so this was part of our connection. So John was also coming up under a master, Arthur Schoenberg, who was a bibliophile, meaning he collected books. He had the largest collection of books on African and African American history in the United States, perhaps in the world. and gave it to the New York Public Library. And he was the custodian of those books. And that's where John met him and apprenticed under him for 4 years. You know, John, like his master, would accumulate over 25,000 books. And then later, as he got older, donate them to Black universities. So Schoenberg was a reader. John was a reader. Schoenberg was a researcher. John was a researcher. Neither of them did that much writing. John's biggest book is Africans at the Crossroads, written later in life, and that's a compilation of articles that he had written. He had written a few other books, but he was more Fess, F-E-S-S. That was the term that the people in his community called him, meaning professor. And he said of all the titles he had, that was the most important. Teaching, reading, and teaching. And his style of teaching, John would do what most professors don't do. He would bring in citations, reading lists for his students. And this is going well beyond a class because some professors only teach the same thing over and over again, or they'll have in their outline a list of references. But John was constantly giving you sources behind each of his lectures. Because under this apprenticeship system, he said it was better than the university system because you didn't have to unlearn stuff. You were getting the truth. But also, you learned about the subject and every side and angle of the subject, the pros and the cons and everything else. And so when John meets Schoenberg at the Schoenberg collection for 4 years, John is in there consuming material, historical material, and then going to the main library in New York and checking out 7 books at a time and reading those and then coming back. And these menial jobs he had, where he could have been a janitor or anything else, he worked for CBS Radio. And at one point, John was able to produce 6 months of programming on African and African American history, 100 and something like 15 shows where he brought in the best scholars in the world and got them to pay them good money, including Isu Madum, who wrote a book on Black nationalism and the Nation of Islam. Flew him in all the way from Nigeria, you know. But generally had these menial jobs until the Black freedom movement opens things up and the students begin to push for Black studies. John Henry Clarke has his opportunity. We give birth to it at 4 universities at San Francisco State. And John is brought into Puerto Rican studies to head the Department of Puerto Rican and Black Studies in New York at Hunter College. And he had to deal with some of the students who brought him in because they were angry because he was so demanding. He told them, I'm demanding because I'm preparing you to be excellent in this world. You're going to face hell when you get out of here. So I'm preparing you for that. So John, later in life, has the opportunity to begin to chair Black studies and was one of the best prepared scholars we had because you weren't going to get prepared through university education. The university was miseducating you. So those of us that had anything to teach, we did this on our own, under in ideal circumstances, mastering masters. So in an overall sense, the main thing John learned from Arthur Schoenberg when it came to the discipline of history, to quote him, was the interrelationship of African history to world history. That was the overall thing. And the first thing Schoenberg taught him was to study his enemy and how his enemy took him out of his history and then took him on the course of study of African and African American history. But apprenticeship is informal. It's not like the university where you're coming in for an hour and 45 minutes, you got a class, the blackboard, and so forth. This is an interaction that's ongoing. That was the way it was with me and John Henry Clarke. We'd be talking 2-3 times a week and asking questions, sharing things. stuff like that. And then sometimes participating in programs together. But it was an informal interaction. That's where you really learn things. I learned a lot about John and his good character and his brilliance in that interaction. John learned the most from Arthur Schoenberg through the walks that they would take when Schoenberg got off the subway and went from 8th Avenue to 135th Street, where the Schoenberg collection was located. And it was those conversations that were most valuable. And John would make comments like, one of the things he learned from Arthur Schoenberg was to be consistent in what he had to say, not contradict himself. See, he's at the stage of jiriso, of mastery. So getting things straight, making sure your stuff is accurate, and then he said, the main thing he got from Arthur Schoenberg was, quote, I tried to do and to think better. I tried to be a better human being. You hear me? So African-American culture rests on an African foundation with new African additions. John's love of Africa grew out of his extended family community, and particularly his grandmother, and then his exposure to teachings on Africa that start with Arthur Schoenberg and leads him on a path where he is totally dedicated to what he called his priesthood, because his mission in life, which is teaching the truth about our history and culture to empower our people, was for him a holy mission, a spiritual mission. And it was a mission that he carried out with magnificent excellence, loving kindness, and absolute beauty. To know John Henrik Clarke, great pleasure, because you're dealing with not just someone that knew a lot, but someone who had a lot inside of him, a lot of goodness. And that was the thing that was most important for me, and for me with anyone I interact with. That's the most important thing. So that's it. Professor John Henrik Clarke, The Shaping of a Master Scholar. And this is only part of it. You have to read the book, Sever, to get the rest of it. And I encourage people to subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Encourage your friends to do so. And if you can, make a Cash App donation. So let's see. Have we got any comments here? Okay. King Pianki. Good name, brother. Pianki is one of your greatest pharaohs of Kemet. 25th dynasty. Professor Clarke was a Grand Master teacher. Is it levels towards becoming a master teacher? If so, is it based on experience, your level of work, or both? Yeah, there are levels. So in the Dogon, there's 4, Jiriso, forward, Giriso, forward, knowledge in front of you, simple knowledge. And Beniso, sideward, peripheral knowledge, still simple, but it takes you more time. It's more difficult to get it because it's not right in front of you. Still simple, but more complex. In the African-American system, that's learned through imitation. What I've just described here is John Henrik Clarke's experience as a imitator at the first level, Jiriso in the Dogon system, imitation in the African-American system, where he is imitating certain qualities of his master. In this particular case, the most important ones being the relationship of African history to world history, beginning to see how those work, and then taking on certain qualities of his masters. It's no coincidence they end up doing similar things. There's some imitation there. So you'll always see at the foundational master that influence on the apprentice, and you see it with John. So John reached a certain level in his life, and it was based on the work that he went through. And so the levels you go through depends on the work you put into it and the contribution you make. And so John went to a high level, you know. See if we got some other young dub. Thank you, Fess over to Shaka. Right on. See if we got any other questions here. John Henry Clarke, this is Lao Tzu. John Henry Clarke continued, all history is a current event, taken from Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Anthony T. Browder. Question, was John Henry Clarke outlining a principle? All history is a current event. Yeah, in the sense that when you're making history, it's right now, it's the moment. And to the extent that you apply your past to the present, that also becomes a current event. Making history is a wonderful experience, by the way. Studying it is one thing, making it is another. And that's a great experience to be able to make history. And you're in the position to do that because the dynamics of power in the world have changed. Your enemy's going down the tube. You understand? If you understand your power levers, then you understand how to exercise it. Born eternal, Lord Allah, self-determination, land, and control of infrastructure. Yeah, these are important in terms of power, and institutions are key when it comes to infrastructure. And of course, you stand on land, so whatever you're building it on is going to be based on that. And it's also the ability of you to protect what you build. And that's a difficult thing in a society like this. So that means that you have to organize your mechanisms well. So you preserve the people that are a part of it, and you preserve the institutions. But always remember this, that it's not the material stuff that's most important. It's the people. And it's the people who you've got to preserve more than anything. John Henry Clarke, Lao Tzu again. John Henry Clarke wrote, the events which transpired 5,000 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 minutes ago have determined what will happen 5 minutes from now, 5 minutes from now, or 5,000 from now. Yeah, especially if you know them, and especially if you're trying to utilize them. It's not going to work so well if your enemy knows it and you don't. My sister had a saying once, very profound. To the extent that your enemy knows more about you than you know about yourself, your enemy's got power over you. And those of us who want to be in the know nothing category put ourselves in that position where the enemy doesn't have to know too very much to know more than we know about ourselves. And of course, a lot of what they think they know is just what they think they know. They don't know. Born eternal, Lord Allah, all I sin, aka the eternal mind consciousness. Yeah, very important. Very important. That's the God within you, you know. Dr. Obutashaka, I haven't seen much scholarship on Dr. Clarke's encyclopedic memory mastery. I believe that it's an essential skill that's a key to all disciplines as well as the maintenance of culture. Yeah, John had a good memory. But I think even more important, he had great insights and a lot of original insights because he had wisdom. He had cultivated that over time. But yeah, he had a great memory. Some people's memories are greater than others. And then the question is, memory of what? Some people are into the memory of minutia, of detail. Some people are into the memory of essentials. So that's part of it. But the question is, what do you do with memory? And if all it is regurgitation and repetition, that's not good enough. But a good memory is an important quality. And in the oral cultures, that was essential. And oral people have the best memories. Southern Blacks have the best memories of Blacks in the US because they generally come out of a more oral culture. Lao Tzu. Um, the first time I met Dr. Clarke, I asked him how he developed his encyclopedic memory. He wasn't able to answer the question. I wonder if you have uncovered his system. Well, he read a lot. And I don't know what his systems were for note taking. When I was in his study, I observed only his book collection, so I didn't look at his files, but I assume he had files and kept some notes of it. Reading itself is going to help with the disciplined memory, but exactly how he did that, I'm not sure. I know when he gave a speech, he called it the Baptist preacher's technique of starting with the topic, departing, and coming back. And that was also a very important, effective method for teaching, because if you're linear, you can become boring. It's a technique that I use. I don't know if you've noticed. There's a reason for that. It's more interesting, and that's the way life is. So, and then he comes out of the South, and the South, the oral tradition is very important. Dennis Boatwright, would John Henrik Clarke be tolerated in today's academia and Black studies? Many of us who are in Black studies today, I've retired, but many in Black studies were shaped by the scholarship of John Henrik Clarke, those that have the deep grounding. And so some of these younger scholars, some of their teachers were influenced by John Henrik Clarke, and some of them have been exposed to his teachings. Part of your question might be, well, would someone without a PhD be able to get in? When I first started teaching at San Francisco State, I didn't have a PhD. And there's a thing called PhD equivalency, and that's for people that don't need one. And so I didn't need a PhD. I went back just to do something, get a PhD. I didn't need one, and that's still possible for some to be brought in. Now, in the university, they have this category for business people who come in, and some of them don't have a degree at all. Many of them, it's a BA or a BS, business administration or something. But they bring them in because of their expertise in business, and this country loves money. And so business departments and science departments get the favored treatment in universities, so they can come in without a PhD. And then there are some who are put on fast tracks. McGeorge Bundy, who was National Security Council advisor to John Kennedy, didn't need a PhD. They had put him on a fast track. They saw he was brilliant, that he would be a good advisor to people who are going to do wrong. And so let him do his number. And he did. Advisor to Kennedy, head of the Ford Foundation. He worked on cooling out the Black liberation movement in the 60s. He did some damage, but he was no dummy. Thank you for your comment, Dennis. Oh, let's say, what is that? Yeah, Brother Ugawa, good comment. A key to anything good in life is loving yourself. You got that right. Knowledge, born eternal, Lord Allah. Knowledge is foundational, yet wisdom is the way. You got that right. Michelle Mayberry. Hello, family from Texas. Hey. Love to Baba, over to Shaka, love to you. Thank you, Michelle. Ogawa, innovation is that domain in anything where you create new schools in the African American context? Yeah, but real new schools. Innovation's no joke. So it's not just saying, oh, I got to something new here. I'm an innovator. Nah. Within the field, you've gone through the mastery at different levels. And then a few strike out into unknown realms, which is dangerous ground because you can look crazy. Your stuff may not work. And so it takes some courage to go into this realm. And some realms, if you take a John Coltrane, some of the realms of innovation in music that he did, well, for some people, his listeners and followers, it didn't sound too good, especially the free jazz period. But that was his free expression. He was trying different things. He's always playing from different angles, innovations, new schools, new real schools, serious stuff. And that's why only 2% of people in any field are in this realm. And it's not one that people usually go to saying, I'm going to be an innovator. It happens that way. Yeah, there's a comment here about Brother Ben Israel, who passed away, good brother, saying, may he rest in peace. Yeah, good brother. Okay, let's go down to the bottom here. Worley Smith, there is value in hearing the truth as it prepares the learner to dig deeper and discover more. Dr. John Henrik Clarke was an amazing researcher and orator. Yeah, true. He drew from his Southern Black tradition. Okay. That looks like that's it. All right. Hope you all got something from that. And until next week, see you again. Encourage people to subscribe to this show. And those of you that are interested in the sixfold stages to mental freedom that haven't signed up, check it out, sign it up. Ty 313, what do you feel he would want us younger generation to do? Know yourself clearly, through digging as deeply into your past as you possibly can, to use it as some inspiration and some motivation and ideas for how you move forward now. To combine any effort you're making to build power with other Black people for your liberation, tying that in to constantly digging deeper and deeper into your culture. I think that he would want the youth to persist in good character and understand that that's the most important position that you have. And for young Black men to show respect for your sisters. And when I say your sisters, I mean females, Black and other, you know, which is showing respect for your mother, you know. So he'd want that because that was an expression of John. And he'd want you to be yourself. He'd want you to be your best self. That's John. And John's a good example of somebody who came from poor, humble circumstances. But it didn't stop him from reaching the heights of intellectual achievement. And in fact, he took every obstacle as an opportunity. That was John, you know. And he also, even when he's doing these menial jive jobs that paid nothing, he always put his best into it, but got it over with as quick as possible so he could do his own homework, you know, do his own study. So it was always doing whatever he could to service his people. And then when his people opened up things, like there was a thing called Haru Act in Harlem, it was a poverty program. And so John got to teach in it for a while. So he took advantage of those opportunities, but he could do it because he was prepared. And then because he respected other people, they respected him and pushed him and supported him. And I think that was also the case, you know, with why he was able to do what he did. Because his people loved the fact that he loved them. You know, I think that was the big deal, you know. A joy to be around. And by the way, when I took him to the gingerbread house, his favorite meal was catfish. And gingerbread house at one point was really good at their cooking, and John just loved his catfish. Southern man, you know what I mean? Okay, that's it. Hotep. Until next Saturday. Appreciate the comments and keep on keeping on.